Okay, Mr. Phobes here. This is the second mini lesson on color, and it's on the color wheel. And we're going to talk about some concepts of the color wheel. So the color wheel was first developed by Sir Isaac Newton in 1704 after his famous experiment where he took a prism into a darkened room and was able to refract the visible electromagnetic spectrum from the sunlight into the room, and he created this refraction. And then what he did is begin to identify it and create the first color wheel. So what he was seeing, if we look on the right, was basically what we see in a rainbow. The color is refracted into the color range of the electromagnetic spectrum. So if you look at this very carefully, this is a replication of the wavelengths of the visible electromagnetic spectrum, and the short wavelengths are the blue colors, and the mediums are the sort of blue greens to greens, and then the longs become the yellow green, yellows, oranges, and reds. And if you can see it, this part of the rainbow is kind of a weird double rainbow. Um, but here's the blue, the short spectrum, and then it goes up into the blue green, the green, the yellow, green, the yellow. So now we're in the kind of medium range, and then we start going to the oranges, the reds. And if you look at it, it's the violet. You can barely see it, but um, uh, Sir Isaac Newton suspected that it was um, right outside of the very cool reds here. Okay, I've just put this here because there's been many different colored wheels proposed over the centuries. And these are just a few. The one on the upper left is by Oscar Schlemmer, who is a famous uh, Bauhaus art instructor. The one on the upper right is a reinterpretation of Newton's original. And the one on the bottom is interesting. It's called the real color wheel. And if you look at it, it's using CMY as the primaries. And this is a current contemporary argument about color that really color can be the broadest spectrum of color can be created through CMY, not RGB. I mean, excuse me, RYB. And that's what we're seeing on the bottom is a CMY color wheel. Um, Color gamut. So this is kind of an important topic to discuss for people who are just beginning to talk about color wheel, color theory. The color gamut is the entire range of color available to a device. So we're talking about a digital device. A color monitor that uses RGB signals has a much wider gamut of colors available than a printer that uses CMY. So if you look at the model here, you can see that the very large circle is the visible color spectrum. So that's what we see with the human eye. So what's interesting is if you look at now we start looking at various devices, and it cannot, so far the technology has not been able to capture the visible electronic spectrum as well as the eye. In fact, you can see that it's quite a bit more narrow. So RGB, the next color gamut down, is the widest color gamut, and then the one next down is Pantone. Pantone is a color system used by graphic designers, and then is this the one with the lowest color gamut is CMY, CMYK. Um, when we start working digitally, we'll make sure that all our files are in RGB, and so we'll be using the widest color gamut available to us. That's great if we end up showing them on a color monitor, but of course we're going to end up having to print them out. So you're going to notice quite a discrepancy between what you see on the monitor, and you may be disappointed in what you see printed. I'm sure that print technology is going to continue to develop, and I bet you there will be a point where print, print technology will probably rival the digital monitor technology, RGB technology. This is a model that I created based on RYB, and in the class for years we used to do everything in RYB. Um, but this is a little model what's important about this is showing the three different steps: the prismatic, the muted, and the chromatic grays. So on the outside ring you see what are called the prismatics, and those are the colors that are the most pure. So they don't have any black or white mixed in them, and they don't have any complementary colors mixed in them. They're absolutely pure. The next step down is created by mixing what are called complements. So if we look at the yellow, um, the muted yellow is made by adding the complement of violet. Now the other thing you'll see is that for the primaries there are what are called warm and cool primaries. Um, if you're painting in RYB, you cannot mix a good violet using like just a red, like a warm red, and mix that with a cool blue. You'll get mud. So you need to use something like a warm blue and a cool red together to mix violet. If you're going to mix orange, you need a warm yellow and a warm red. And if you're going to mix green, you're going to need a cool yellow and a cool blue. Um, One of the reasons I switched to CMY, you'll see, is that we do away completely with the warm and cool primaries. The other thing to look at is what are known as the warm hues and the cool hues. So some models show the warm hues going from yellow to red violet and the cool hues going from violet to yellow green. I've also read, and this sort of makes sense, that yellow green and red violet are what they would call ambiguous in terms of their temperature. So they're kind of neutral. They can be used either as warm or cool colors as you're working. This is the color wheel model that we're going to work with digitally, and I've got it so you can download. It's the CMY color wheel, and it shows the primaries and the secondaries. So one of the things just to be aware about this model is made of 24 colors, not 12 colors. Most color wheels, the one we're going to make especially, is 12. What's key about using this color wheel is that we're going to use the colors that are labeled and then the colors with the circles on them. So we're not going to use the colors, for instance, that are right between cyan and cyan blue. So we'll be using cyan, cyan blue, blue, red magenta, magenta, I'm sorry, this is violet, magenta, red, orange, yellow, yellow green, green, and cyan green. We won't, we may end up mixing some of these, but we will start out using just those particular colors that are named. So just be aware of that when we start working with this color wheel. So let's look at the difference between the CMY color wheel and RYB color in terms of the mixtures. So we have primaries, secondaries, and intermediates. This just shows again that in the CMY we have yellow, cyan, and magenta as our primaries. In the RYB we have yellow, blue, and red. These circles indicate what are known as the intermediates. You may in other classes have heard these called tertiary colors, and that kind of makes sense. You've got primary, secondary, and tertiary. The problem with this definition is that it doesn't leave us a definition for a color that would be mixed with all three primaries. I like this name, the intermediate. That means it's between or intermediary between a primary and secondary, and that's exactly how it's created. So let's look at this. Primaries are prime and cannot be mixed. We talked about that. Secondaries are a primary and a primary mixed 1 to 1, and intermediates are a primary and a secondary 2 to 1. So what that means is you've got 2 parts of a primary to 1 part of a secondary, and that will give you an intermediate. We'll see that when we start mixing colors. So here are the subtractive RYB primaries. We've looked at them: red, yellow, and blue. And then here are the subtractive RY-based secondaries, orange, green, and violet. The 6 intermediates are created with a primary and a secondary. They're yellow, green, yellow, orange, red, violet, and blue, green. When you call out the name of an intermediate color, you always call out the primary that it's made with and the secondary that it's made with. So it's the primary first and then the secondary. So you wouldn't say green, yellow, orange, red, violet, red, those kinds of things. You call it out with the primary name first and then the secondary. Here are the CMY primaries. So we've got cyan, magenta, and yellow. The subtractive CMY secondaries are red, green, and blue. And then the subtractive CMY intermediates are orange, red, magenta. Okay, so there's the orange, red, magenta. See, it's between the magenta and red. Violet, and then what we'll call cyan blue, because it's between cyan and blue is a secondary in this model, and then what's called cyan green, and then yellow green. So the only kind of odd names are the red magenta, the cyan blue, and the cyan green. Okay, so let's look at a saturation model here. So again, the outside ring are our saturated colors, and then what we will be doing is we will be mixing the complementary colors. Complementary colors are colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. If we look at this again, the ring that steps in are the muted colors and then the chromatic grays. Neutral gray is in the center. We'll talk more about how we're going to create this. I've got a better model of this coming up. So this is the CMY color wheel that comes in the kit. Now I've peeled off the front of this so we can see it a little bit better. But this is the model that we're going to use to create our color wheel. So what we're doing is we are creating all 12 of the prismatic hues, and we're going to mix them only from cyan and yellow. So to get yellow green, well, let's go to green. So to get green, we're going to mix equal parts yellow and cyan. That'll give us green. To get cyan green, then we're going to mix cyan and green together. And to make yellow green, we're going to mix green and yellow together. To make red, we're going to take magenta and yellow, and that will actually make red. Then we take our red and we mix it with yellow, and that'll give us orange. We take our red and we mix it with magenta, and that'll give us red magenta. And then to get our blue, we're going to mix magenta and cyan together, and that will give us our blue. And then cyan and blue together, cyan blue, and then magenta and blue together, and that'll give us our violet. Okay, so this is the last slide. This is what we're going to be doing when we start our color wheel. So again, we're going to be using the CMY colors, and so you're going to do a value scale of one color. So any one of the colors on the color wheel you can choose, and you're going to start with it in its correct value position. We'll talk about more of that in the third lesson. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take and you're going to create from the primaries and the secondaries, you're going to create these series of the muted colors, and then we're going to create the chromatic grays, and then we're going to make a neutral gray by mixing opposites together. So we're not going to make a gray using black and white. We're going to make it by basically using all three colors. So that's basically it for the color wheel part of this.